I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. In this episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, we continue our series of speaking with advanced practitioners of advanced co-regulation, self-regulation, and resilience skills, and most importantly, transformational resilience skills, which are called for in times like this, like no other time in human history. Please help me welcome Mandy Sandbach. All right, welcome everybody. This is of course another round of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. And here we are, still consider it kind of early in 2021, which I still am referencing in contrast to 2020, which is like no other year I've ever experienced. And I'm also more committed than ever to what I've been announcing little by little in these past few podcast episodes, that this year is really an even bolder step than the past couple of years, where each year I've been really declaring my commitment and refining that commitment to speaking with people who have something to say about how to be more and more present in the face of larger and larger stressors in life, as the world seems to be full of larger and larger stressors. As anyone who's watched the podcast for some time now, you'll know that I cast a net out to quite a broad range of folks who, some of whom are climate scientists, some are other scientists that speak about some of the other global scale, existential level challenges that we face. Others are in the social services or the healing professions, and still others, as those of you who watch the podcast know, I've really been leaning on the folks who have something to say about the field of transformation. And that usually ends up having to do with either healing or personal development work. And that can be on the individual or on the group level. And my guest today, Mandy Sandbach, yes? Sandbach.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. That tells you right there how new we are to each other. We've just met. And this is all a result of an earlier and frequent guest on the podcast, Louise Lebrun. And, I tend to listen when Louise talks. She's one of those folks who has some heft in the conversation of what does it take to truly engage in a transformative way with life in these times. And if you haven't heard my earlier conversations with Louise or any of the senior practitioners in her work, which is called Well Systems, please check them out. I'll put a few links in the show notes to earlier conversations. And Mandy, I'm really enjoying this not knowing you yet, and having us both have an opportunity to introduce each other to each other. And I'm particularly appreciative that you are okay with my idea, which is that I would just introduce you to my body of work and to some of the aspects that I'd be interested in sharing with you about how I do this thing. This guy over here. and then just see if that sparks you in any way. So I thank you for being willing to do that. And so I'll give you the briefest version that I can, because I don't think you need much. I really get a sense that Louise knows that there's already some built-in overlap. I don't think there has to be some excruciatingly long biography over here. But let me just mention that I'm Dean Walker. I live in Southern Oregon. I've been in the training and development world, both individual and group focus of transformation-based work, whether that's in the corporate sector or the community development sector or working with couples in intimacy. It's been, about 35 years of that kind of stuff. And I've always had a very strong leaning toward just loving the aspects of Earth and the environment that I grew up in. And that was the ocean and the desert of Southern California and Baja California, and I also had a early exposure to a number of different kinds of energetics studies, from plant medicine and other psychedelics to shamanic work to just being in nature for extended periods of time, and that was literally life-saving for me, in which I grew up in the human environment, was extraordinarily challenging, with a mother who was all over the map, alcoholic, and a number of other challenges. So there was plenty of reason for me to want to get out into nature. So again, mentioning that because little did I know that while I studied psychology and I studied a number of organizational development tracks and brought that into the corporate work in particular, almost all of it transformation based. And I got to say that the combination for most of my adult life was full well knowing that we were on a track to destroying ourselves and the planet. I knew that from about 9 years old. And people who've watched the podcast know this story quite well. I tell it fairly often, that really I got my entree into the field of being present to the earth and our relatedness to it through a guy named Jacques Cousteau, who did Sunday specials from time to time when I was a kid. And he would just show us the most beautiful underwater oceanic panoramas that was just extraordinary. And he would also tell us the real truth about what was going on in the area in terms of human damage to the area. And I don't remember an exception in the program where he didn't include something about that. And what I noticed was I was in tears. I could barely breathe when he was describing that. And none of the other people around me, adults or children, had anywhere near the same reaction. And so it really shifted and established a foundation that I have not shifted from for my whole life, which is that the vast majority of people literally have disconnected from any relatedness with Earth. What this particularly has to do with now is that it was about just shy of 10 years ago that I really got my woke moment of, yeah, I'm pretty aware guy of my whole life, but I had chosen the corporate track. I'd flown around to do this sexy work all around the world, and I knew that I was not helping things at all. And I also knew that most of my mentors in the energetic department, they had coached me and they didn't know one another. There's a number of teachers, number of mentors, and none of them knew each other. And all of them were consistently clear that there's really nothing salvageable about the human experience. How we're doing this human expression on the planet was going to take us down. And they didn't say it with any charge or any politics or any, it was just, that's what it is. So do what you do, but just know. Mm-mm. So again, it was about 10 years ago when I just got that validated at a scale and a rapidity that I just never could have guessed. So within my old guy lifetime, oh, by the way, the first thing I did when I got my eyes opened in that way is I had to vet the material, because this is either the craziest bullshit to come down the pike, or this is the transformation of humanity, whether we're ready for it or not. And I had to vet that, because how can you not? Is just how I'm built, you know. And so I turned that into writing a book called The Impossible Conversation, that I put out in 2017, where I had just vetted not only climate change, but abrupt climate change. And not only that, but 5 or 6 other massive global existential impacts that we are having on the planet. And so that's once I vetted it, once I really saw this is happening, I don't have any questions anymore. I'm a lay person, but I've done my homework and this is happening. And so what I saw in that process and since is that far more important elements that I could bring to be of service to life on the planet in this condition is that earlier energetics work and the plant medicine work and transformation based work. And so that's what I did. I disconnected from all the usual ways that I was making money and all that corporate stuff, and really committed myself to creating a body of work where the elevator pitch for my work is uh, that I'm offering transformation based support and resources to people bravely facing human caused collapse of Earth and human systems. So you can tell by that lovely, sexy title that I got the phone ringing off the hook from people who can't wait to get my assistance and the resources that I'm offering. But it is growing. It is growing. It is still quite a modest audience, but it is growing. And in these past couple of years, I've really shed the last couple of layers of wanting to be diplomatic or wanting to kind of round the edges for people. I don't want to traumatize them, and I mean, I'm got to take care of people and so on. And it's just clear to me that there's no real need or room for that anymore, with the exception of age appropriate material for children and so on. Of course, I'm willing to do that. And perhaps this is the final piece that I can put in. Thank you for your patience with all this, by the way. Um, how I somewhere in the process of putting together this body of work and the podcast and all these elements to be of service to life, which, by the way, humanity is second or third down that list of who I'm serving here. I've had the privilege of meeting a number of different people, and I've been around the block with both designing and delivering transformation based work for people to be of service in that way. And I also know quite a few folks who are profound creators of that kind of work, one way or another, whether it's somatic or plant medicine or contemplative or whatever. And that's how I got to know Louise and a number of the women from her lineage. And it's really a time like no other in human history. I'm clear on that. And I'm unapologetic about speaking directly to it. And there's an immediacy that I've found in Louise's work, which reminds me very much of the energetics domain, plant medicine domain and even the transformation-based work. There's something where there's a possibility, there's access to possibility in the moment. There's that immediacy, that's a crackling presence in the moment, as opposed to productivity in the moment and, you know, all the other alternatives of business as usual way of interpreting and seeing. So that's why I keep interviewing Louise and any of the other senior folks in her lineage that will talk with me. And we seem to get along quite well, even though it's an all-woman thing. I guess I'm a part-time male presence and somewhere in a corner, you know, of the work. And it is a pleasure to be connected in that way. And a number of other bodies of work as well. So it's not just my work that I'm putting together here, but I've really called it an invisible toolbox that I keep present for my own practices of reconnection with life, and also a menu of practices that others who are doing this work might want to choose from at some given time. And I guess the last thing I would say in this introduction, because I want to say it in a way that I am more present with you. I've been really speaking to the podcast audience out in the future, and I'm just noticing a shift as I'm looking at you right now, and I'm shifting to be present with you. And so that shifts it from being descriptive or telling you the narrative that adds up to us being able to talk and so on, to now I have a very much a felt sense of you. And it's quite moving to have shifted, and it's quite moving to be with you right now. And I'm curious if any of that long-winded introduction inclines you to share anything about how you'd like to be known.
The invitation to bring myself to this moment is brilliant, and it doesn't always come in community. So I appreciate that. There's this term that Naomi Irons introduced me to a couple of years ago called presencing. And it's this notion of bringing myself into the presence, into the present moment, to be mindful and completely here. My breath being the gateway to that in my body, and allowing my body, my device, to soften enough that I can start feeling with more than just like, you know, my brain. I can open up and relax and tap into things that I have access to differently when I'm not talking to you from this logical, maybe historical, you know, storytelling place. And so I think powerful things can happen when we are completely in that moment and in that flow. It allows me to tap into that. And as you were doing your intro and how you would like to be known, there were so many hits. I'm just grinning as you're speaking, because I can see the layers of overlap. I've been doing this long enough, I don't even know, 9 or 10 years with Louise, to trust that when she connects me with another human, it's for really magical reasons. So there was lots of like initial hits of overlap and content that may or may not flush out in this conversation. But I definitely have the sense that I'm in the right space in the right time right now. So So how I would like to be known. I had a woman in a class I was teaching yesterday say to me, "Oh, I read your bio. It's so great." And I was like, "Bio? What bio? Where did you read that?" And she was talking about my website. And I had this moment of, well, what the heck does that actually say now? Because I live such a present and an ever transforming, as I'm sure you've had experience with women in the well systems experience or paradigm, it's fast changing. So just as I am certain that Mandy, is this way sitting before Dean today in an hour, I know that I will be different than that. And I couldn't recall in any way what my bio said on my website. It left me with like, oh, maybe I should like revisit that and be with it, because there's probably some updating required. I grew up in northern British Columbia, and so I grew up in a really outdoor, in the forest. My family hunted and fished and canned and jammed and pickled and gardened and all of these wonderful things that I now know to be wonderful. When I was a kid, they were traumatic and awful, that I had to pick raspberries every day or beans in the summertime and my fingers hurt. It was more like child labor than it was, planting seeds of something regenerative for the future, which is what I feel those moments are now in my 43-year-old body. But that was sort of setting the tone for my journey. And as everybody does, we grow up and we become autonomous from our parents, and we, in our own ways, find our own life and sometimes rebel. So I moved a long ways away, and I started a career that had such a level of intensity and exposure to daily violence and the most awful things that society has to offer. In the form of policing. And that led me on a 10-year, I would say stray away from myself, but it required that level of intensity and violence to start to recognize that I wasn't really in my life. And so there was these sort of like choice point moments as I was growing through my 20s and then getting married and giving birth to 2 boys, that started to shift. And I started to hear these whispers of myself where there wasn't alignment in how I was living. And all of that led to the birth of my boys. And when that happened, I had such a different, there's just something massive. How could it not change, growing another being inside of you? And I didn't necessarily have the language in the moment, post babies, but I knew I couldn't go along to get along anymore in that world, and I couldn't stay silent. And it was like all the history and the lineage of it came out in all the history and lineage of how women have been treated for generations. It came out in that. It came out in moments of deep unkindness and that I just couldn't tolerate. And so that led me to exploring sort of this it started with this conversation around yogurt one day. And as I started to question what I was eating and what I was putting in my body, it led me down this path of holistic nutrition. And so as I started to question those things, and I started to learn and educate myself, like you said, you did all of the research. Well, I did all of that. And my gateway was really just what I was putting on in my body and the body of my kids. And that led, it's the rabbit hole. So that was my entrance way into the rabbit hole. And then pretty soon it was questioning the food and well, I should be growing my own food. And then finding these most magical moments of deep intimacy and sacredness as my hands were in the soil. And then as my body softened in these experiences, all of the grief and the lockdown and the rage and the outrage that I had kept at bay, I couldn't do it anymore. So it looked like a blow up in my life where I quit my, professional job. I divorced my husband. I started on a completely different 90-degree path. And that's just it's just been 10 years of, and then I discovered well systems about 9 or 10 years ago.
Mm.
And that was the practical, transformative body of knowledge that allowed me to come completely full circle and back into my own life,
Mm-hmm.
and taught me the, quantum TLC, for example, what I have access to when I breathe and I soften my body and I let go of the content of what's outside of me, or I take it back as a reflection of something inside of me that I'm not listening to. And it's just sort of been that for the last 10 years,
Mm-hmm.
a great softening and a great gentleness. And my gateway drug was the soil. My gateway drug was looking at the worms and the nematodes and the mites and the root systems, and knowing that there's a different way to do this human thing we were talking about earlier, that you were mentioning in your intro. And I know that as sure as I know anything, that when I look outside of myself, first of all, I have to be very cautious about where I take my cues. But Gaia, the earth and the ecosystems that she is made up of, have been my greatest teachers. There's no storylines about that. I can be out in a garden space or a forest space or a prairie forest or an ocean environment, and I can stop and drop and breathe into my body and begin that process of presencing and have access. All the rest of the reality around me, I then can let go of. And so that's gotten me to where I am today.
Yeah.
So I do lots of different things. I do a ton of teaching and hold space for gatherings. And really, if we're getting down to the essence of who I am an invitation for reciprocity and relationships, and understanding that is the only resiliency we have, because all of our human strategies and technologies, and they're obsolete. They're just not working. And it always comes back to that for me. So that's what these conversations are for me, are these beautiful interconnections within that web. And each one makes, as we connect and we fully show up in the magnitude that we are and the gifts that we are here to share, we create another little connection within that web, and the more of those, the better moving forward. Yeah. So I don't know if that actually says who I am, but that's a long-winded.
All right. Well, thank you for that. I'm appreciating that we're sharing a few of the kind of buzz phrases or the jargon, if you will, for the well systems work. Because, a whole lot of my audience, and certainly a lot of my intent around having these conversations is to introduce folks to other alternatives, other ways of being, other ways of relating. And what I've seen time and again, having worked an awful lot with folks who are just becoming collapse aware, just becoming aware of something's really not right with how we do this human being on earth thing. And it would be really wise for those who are awake at that level to take on some skills, to expand their skills and capacity to be present in the face of larger and larger stressors. One of the phrases that came to my mind, you didn't quite say exactly these words, but it seems like you're right on them when you were talking. And that is, let me start with a kind of an overarching question that one might ask. So if not this business as usual way of relating and way of being in the world, then what? Yeah, simple, kind of broad question. And if in this business as usual world, our attention is the coin of the realm and it's literally being harvested out of us, in a weaponized fashion. That's a whole nother conversation. But what that sets up is a dynamic in which we are so deeply disempowered and disconnected from our deeper self, from other people, from earth, and I'd say even from soul, that there's this extraordinary disempowerment that we start to call normal. And within that, the only direction that a person who is suffering from this amount of disconnection, the only direction they know to go to find out what's going on, how do I find out what's true? Where can I find a sense of authentic aliveness? Where do I look? And the only place that's left is outside of us, since we don't have any connection with deeper self. So the piece of, I don't like the word jargon, but it's just a common phrase in the Well Systems work, is to be internally referent. Like, where I look for that truth in any given moment is I look internally, and it's internally, not just randomly turning the flashlight in or something. It's actually an extraordinary landscape that those of us who have spent some time distinguishing it, it's an extraordinary, rich world. And I heard some of those words that you shared were kind of along those lines. So I'm wondering if you could share whatever your reality is around internally referent in the way that you've been talking about, and externally referent from perhaps the contrast of the life before that you were describing as well. I'm curious if there's anything that you'd like to share about that contrast.
Yeah, and I'll start by sharing what I tell people in my classes. We don't all just wake up drinking green smoothies one day. That's not what happens. Because when you teach people about nutrition and whole plant foods, and the thought of a green smoothie is the most disgusting thing you can come up with. And so I was talking about the gateway earlier. I feel like that's part of it. One of the things through cultural conditioning, I think that's been lost in how we've related to our parents growing up and the people around us, the churches and the schools, and the one of the things that we've lost is a sense of curiosity and play and fun. And I know as a 43-year-old, I am discovering that likely for the first time since those beginning stages of, the child of nature out in the forest, and picking my own snacks in the forest, and knowing what I could eat and what I couldn't eat, and building forts. And, sometime between her and my 30-year-old self, I lost that sense of curiosity. And so we don't all just wake up knowing what internally referenced means. We can't even begin to comprehend it. And first of all, I believe that our brain is going to lock us down, because all of us have experienced forms of trauma and experiences that have been compartmentalized inside of us, and rules written around it to kind of keep it away so that it doesn't eat us up in that way. And our brain instinctually knows that if we start to soften our body, and we start to soften our breath, and we allow the tears to come, or we allow the fire or the rage or whatever it is, that we may just not ever stop. And that feels, scary. And in order to tap into what I know to be my internal cues, I have to soften my hold, my grasp, my control on my reality enough to start to be willing to see what I'm saying, observe what's coming out of my mouth, observing what I'm telling my children. And so all of that process started for me in the moment I realized I'm going to end my life or die if I don't start living an authentic life. That was a surrender moment, a massive surrender moment. And from there, honestly, I was probably just too exhausted to fight anymore myself. But the willingness to allow breath back into my body, and then the tiniest little bit of curiosity. Oh, I just told my kids they shouldn't sit too close to the TV because they'll go blind. And then realizing that's not my mouth, that's not my story. I don't even believe that. And then these things start to creep in, these like falsehoods. You're tearing at these little threads of a storyline of rules and dogma that were woven for me. And as I start to see, it becomes that whole concept of different lens that I see the world through. And then pretty soon I'm willing to face how I was parented. And then pretty soon I'm willing to face how I am parenting my children. And it's a journey to get there. You're not, the well system's body of knowledge, the recognition that we are quantum biological beings, that we wear this flesh, that I am the force that animates, this tissue, and that I live in a holographic universe, meaning I create my own reality. That really allowed me to drop all the rules about what I was and wasn't supposed to do, because here's this new knowledge, and there's scientists who've written books and done research on this. This isn't some hokey pokey, whatever. I couldn't ignore that anymore. So when I redefined who and what I am as human, that also gave me a level of trust and a level, being able to start to look under that carpet in my life of the things I didn't want to look at. And so the internally referenced piece comes from those little tiny moments, building more and more trust as we go. And recognizing whose voice is talking in my head. Is that my mother's? Is that my grandmother's? Is that what my teachers told me? Or do I genuinely believe what it is that I'm saying? And if I don't believe that, then I have this massive overwhelm of potential. And then I get to rewrite that story. But that can't come until I'm willing to soften my body. And I had a different place to stand on what my body was and what it was capable of. But the curiosity is a big part of that. I have to be willing, because your brain's going to stop you. There's all kinds of reasons why you shouldn't relax into the world we're seeing right now around us, because it's so dangerous on every level. We could list 25 things right now that you're going to die from very shortly if we go down that road. So it's like, for me, during this entire, this is a transformation. Where we are in the stage of that, I don't know, but we'll call it 2020 because there's a label for that. The world is really macro. There's all kinds of information. There's all kinds of things we can take in. Like you said, it's weaponized almost. It's almost like warfare. It's like the more that happens, the deeper I go inside, listening for myself, deeply rooted to the essence of who I am. And I access that from my breath. That's it. I access that when my hands are in the soil, because that happens to be my medium. If I was a dancer, perhaps movement in my body would create that. But it's those tiny little choices in the moment, recognizing where I have them, that allows me to remain in here. Because the only thing that makes sense is this. Nothing makes sense out here to anybody. And even if you knew something prior to 2020, it's all changed now. So I don't know if that's where you were headed with that, but
that's just beautiful. I'd be curious. You shared just a tiny bit about your work with the soil, with the earth, and I'd be curious if there's more for you to say or share. What I'll do is I'll just describe kind of a hybrid way of relating with life and with earth and so on that I've got going on, and just see if it sparks you to share anything about how you do it. Starting about geez, I don't know, I want to say like 13 years old. I was given my first instruction in meditation and TM, which is a particular kind of meditation where you'd have a mantra that you repeat and so on. And it's quite heady, is what I was struggling with almost immediately. And yet I could get there were some value in stillness and having a relationship with stillness, and I could get it, but I struggled like crazy through my first few orientations to different lineages of meditation, because it was about being in relationship with my thoughts. It was all about keeping track of or distracting or whatever. It was a relationship with head and thoughts. And it was over quite a bit of time, number of years, and especially as I was getting more and more experience with plant medicine, energetics, and so on, and the transformation based work, a lot of that was somatic, was in my body. And so I started to blend the two, the contemplative built in the head and the other practices that and organs of perception that were available to me through these other practices. And so a term that I picked up along the way is that there are implicit senses, different than the five senses we're used to. And I almost always do this when I'm describing my implicit senses, because they seem to live somewhere between the base of the top of my neck. Oh, down, woo. I lost my headset. There we go. From about the top of my neck down to my perineum. And it's there that I get virtually all of my signals about what's true in this moment. And from a lot of different um, practices and years of visiting these different locations in my own body or bodies. And the implicit senses have that immediacy that we both talked about just a little bit in this time. And they both are obviously internal in terms of where I refer to in my system for what is real, what is true, what is the direction for this moment, and so on. And what I guess I'm saying is it actually is another layer of inner, like deeper inner, that I wouldn't have known primarily from, the deepest experiences I've had with that is through plant medicine. It really just took me all the way back as far as I know to go. And so it's quite an extraordinary thing. Like to bring it to right now, in creating the body of work that I'm doing, I'm introducing people to practices from other lineages, and then also ones that I've come up with. And this is one of them that's quite extraordinary. This is my first time trying to offer people at scale how can they access their implicit senses without necessarily being inclined toward plant medicine or other psychedelics or breath work or any of the kind of extreme end of what can get us there. So I should probably stop here, because I what I'm wanting to know is if you have your own version of what I'm calling implicit senses that you've developed, and you're noticing it. What it seems like is mapping out the territory that's inside, deep inside. And I'm primarily prompted to ask you this question because you've mentioned about the earth, those little living elements that are so profoundly alive at such a deep level. And that's a part of who you are in this world. It's part of how you express in this world. So let me just stop there and just see, can you tell us about your deeply inner territory like that?
I like that inner territory. I definitely, I guess I'll start by saying that I do feel, well, it goes back to the story of being human and what we have been taught and what, say, the quantum sciences are telling us now. I know there's so much more to discover, and at some point, my grandchildren hopefully will know, have language for what we're discussing here today. I know it as a feeling. I know it as something that emerges inside of me as a sensation, whether it's a sixth sense or seventh sense or my intuition or my, higher self, whatever. There's all kinds of language we could attach to that. Suffice to say, though, that it's a compass inside of me now, much like what you just described. And I sometimes describe it as being in flow or not, because I can feel the expansive quality of just the movement when I'm in alignment. And I often only know that when I'm misaligned, or I've said yes, when I really meant no. And then there's this like feeling inside of me that doesn't quite completely align. It jars a little bit, and in the tiniest little ways now. So before I could deny myself or that impulse or that whatever that larger, maybe it's an insight or something I feel compelled to say or share. If I ignore it, I used to be able to ignore it for like 2 months or 2 years. I stayed in a marriage years longer than I should have. I knew that. I can't do that anymore. As much as 15 minutes of misalignment causes my body an immense amount of grief. And it's like this sweet thing that sits like it's expansive in my body. It's a tender, intimate, tingly like sensation. And so one of the gateways, I'll say, is when I'm able to sit and be in nature. So I love your story around meditation. I quit meditation and yoga cold turkey after I met Louise, because I realized I'd been using that as a strategy to cope with my life. And I'd be fine for 5 minutes, and 5 minutes after my yoga and my meditation class, I'd be a raging lunatic. So I sort of railed against it for a bit and stopped. Now that this is more of an embodied experience for me, I can sit in a forest system, in a prairie system, in my backyard, in a community garden, and I can listen and I can open myself up with my breath first, coming back to the moment, and then I can hear differently, and I can smell differently, and I can observe differently. And then I start to sense in my tissues the layers of connection around me. And that's really the fine-tuning fork for me, is connection. When I seek to look for relationship in the soil, in the water, in a food forest, in a regular wooded system, when I intentionally seek those relationships, those connections, that interconnectedness, it activates whatever that other instinct or intuition is for me. So it's a superpower in many ways, because I know things that I haven't read. I just instinctually know I'm going to plant that with that, because that's what feels right in my relationship to those plants. And then I'll read something later on, I'll go, well, of course they were supposed to be that way, because now my knowledge is catching up to what I instinctually knew. So I've tried that on too, to know that there's validity, and I have deep trust in that feeling now. I didn't when I was a child. It wasn't safe to do so. I wasn't tall enough to leave my house when things, were bad. But now it is what I call, I don't want to say cultivate. It is what I invite more and more, deeper and deeper layers of connection with myself, and myself with my family and myself with the world around me. And when I'm when I'm completely in that place, and even when I'm not, even when I'm mindlessly, watering or weeding, or I get an experience out of that as well. But that becomes my mirror constantly of reminding, again, relationships. So it's like me is the sweetest little voice. And I just have to practice, start listening for that. And it feels like a feeling, not so much a voice. Maybe some people see color, or they have a dance move or something that gets them there. It's different for all of us. But the feeling inside of me, that openness, that flow, that like, I know I'm tuned on and I'm on receive in those moments.
Yeah. Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. There's another part of this body of work that I a couple of years ago just got a very strong hit, that even though I'm not a parent, I've actually done a lot of proxy parenting in transformation-based community development work with at-risk youth, training adults to work with at-risk youth. And so I saw a real need once I had started to create the body of work to provide this transformative resources and support to people. I saw that parents would have an extraordinary situation on their hands. That folks who don't have children just won't have the same experience. And so I created this kind of sister podcast. So this one's the poetry of predicament, and the sister podcast is called Take My Hand: Conscious Parenting in a Time of Stolen Dreams. And this is a series of interviews much like this with both parents and possibly with their children as well. And a number of different families participated and continue to participate from time to time. And a lot of parallel content that would support someone who's interested in studying that, or being engaged with that. And like anyone who's approaching a more significant engagement with life, a different way of relating with the experience of being alive, it starts out at a fairly plain level in terms of what are the skills that one might be interested in. And you and I both have shared a little bit about meditation, yoga. But first, if we start with the average person doesn't really have any personal development experience. They don't really, it's like meditation, why? And, that kind of thing. So, and let's consider that the vast majority of people on the planet. So then there's some smaller group that is engaged at least what I call the first aid level of self-regulation, co-regulation, of being able to return themselves to a decent state of being volitionally, and somewhat interested in being aware of, there's some stuff going on in the world and I want to make it a better place, and I don't really know how because I work a lot and blah, blah, blah. So not as big as the first group, slightly smaller, somewhat engaged, few basic skills at the first aid level. Almost everything you've described would be at least in this next, again, significantly smaller than the other two, group of people who have consciously taken on practices that take time to integrate, that really take a commitment to desaturate ourselves to some degree from this business as usual world, and to be able to see more clearly, like, I've been saturated in this since the day I was born. Oh my gosh. And then to be able to consciously um, invite, I think was the word you just used a little while ago, invite different ways of being, invite different presence, invite different levels of awareness, and so on. And so this is nudging up into the area of, some of us have heard about the wisdom traditions, so many different many of them ancient traditions where people, some of these people would sacrifice their entire life, would just give their entire life over to these practices that were ending up sounding awfully similar to many of the practices we've been talking about. So with all that, I'm curious if you could share any part of your experience of being a parent, particularly with the contrast of seeing your life before this level of engagement and since this level of engagement. And I'm also very curious, how has that shifted you as a parent? And can you share anything about how your children are with any of this material, any of this experience? Has some of it, as a friend of mine used to say, gotten on them? Have you gotten some on them? Or do they have their own fabulous, thing going on that they're on their own track? Or as with some of the parents that I've interviewed, no matter how hard they try, it's just not something that their children want to engage with at all. You know how it can go sometimes. So wide open. If there's anything in that realm that you'd like to share, I'd love to hear it.
That's a conversation unto itself. I'm certain of that.
Oh yeah. Well,
but I appreciate it.
And while I'm happy to post this particular interview also in Take My Hand, let's be sure to set up another round of interview where we just dive straight into that at the beginning. If you're willing, I would love that. I think it would be of immense service to folks to hear your experience at length. But start us out. What do you got?
Yeah, I'm laughing. So I have about to be 16-year-old, 17 and 18-year-old. And so my kids, especially the older one, knew Mandy pre-well system and post. And so, I've been around Naomi's kids since they were little, and Raina's kids I've known since they were born. And then there's my kids. And so my kids have had sort of that coma mom for longer periods of time. And it shows, and each one is unique too. But so when I woke up in my own life, I was able to see my role and what I was perpetuating as a mother and as a parent, that in an attempt to not do what my mom did, I was leveraging the same thing through a push away and not that, which is hilarious, not so hilarious, but a bit ironic that we're not going to be our mothers, and then we turn around doing things that end up creating the same trauma pattern that our mothers created. So that was one of the first things I noticed as I was waking up. It was such a lifeline for me as I woke up in my own life and started to engage the well systems, paradigm of thinking about the world, that I was no different than a religious fanatic force feeding my children. And I only know that now. I didn't realize that at the time. And so I did an about face on my children. I went from a ragey, yelly faced, depressed, angry mother who was very short tempered and had no patience for my kids and their innocence. I had no foundation or capability of being able to hold them as the sacred beings they were and allow them to just express as they came here to do and be. I had no skills, no ability, no willingness to do any of that. So I went from that to deciding that my children were these God forces, that they just came here to be themselves, and so they could choose for themselves. And so I made this massive 180 switch one day, in their minds, one day. And it was a disaster for many, many years, as it was great fodder for my own evolution as I, floundered through that. I also had a partner who probably thought I was a little bit nuts because I had made a massive transition in terms of him and I as well. And so as I was engaging, decloaking and engaging and manifesting and going through my own personal journey of growth and evolution, I would come home and have this pressurized experience of being on, in person with a group of women gathering under this paradigm is seamless. Everybody knows themselves to be God force. They know that what moves through them belongs to them. And then I'd come home to my children who were already traumatized from those, formative years. And then a partner who had no space for his own, feelings. And so it became this like pressurized experience constantly. As I surrendered to my own process of change and transformation and the copious amounts of grief that I felt for all the, content that my brain would tell stories about, the more I allowed space for that grief and movement, the more I had access to my gentle, kind, innocent, younger self. And when that switch happened, all of a sudden I had massive capacity for my children to be in full flow and not have to stop, their intensity and then tell them a story or a byline about how they're a God force and what moves through them belongs to them. And it became less religious and just more in the moment and just kind, because up until then I was force feeding it to them like a mantra, this is yours, this fire belongs to you, but they had no trust in that like I did for myself. And so 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, as they progressed, I started to let go of any responsibility in terms of where they were headed and how they were feeling, and really made it about being present. And so all of those motherly and parenting habits of wanting them to be polite and kind to each other and, well-adjusted people in society and, picking up their socks and I don't know, whatever the rules are about kids and parents, I had to let all of that go. In fact, there was a period of time where I'm like, could you just stop calling me mom? I just need a break from that role so I can redefine it for myself. They wouldn't buy that. They didn't appreciate that. But I needed to decouple what that had been for me. And it was always directly mirrored back to me in my children's actions and behaviors. And so now as we have these teenagers who, young adults, my 18-year-old turned 18 in a pandemic, graduated from high school. What a lame gift that was. Mm-hmm. He's still living at home and it's very different now, but that is all because of the work that I've been able to do for myself and letting go of, because as I imagine this is for many parents, but I realized I had a choice point a few years ago that they were moving out of my house at some point. And if I didn't start practicing letting go of control and intentionally looking for the places where I was staying static in my own evolution because I was tied to whatever it was I was hoping for them, that none of us were going to be healthy the moment we were empty nesters. And so as much as that broke my heart, I allowed myself to stop micromanaging what was going on for them and allowed the grief. It's been 4.5 years of constant grief and letting go. But I have such a clear, deep respect and generosity of spirit for my kids that I never did. It doesn't matter to me if they've heard me. I mean, that's not totally true. I would like them to wake up into their own lives for their own sake, for whatever gift it is they came here for. But because I made it religious in the beginning, I did myself a disservice and them, because I force fed it to them. Now it's like it's a not that thing. So I had to throw my hands up and not hold an outcome for all of those things. And now what I'm seeing after 2 solid years of really just taking a breath before I react, recognize when I'm triggered, allowing them to create whatever they need to create. Sometimes it's really messy and ugly, and sometimes it's easy, and sometimes it's retching. My youngest son was diagnosed with a systemic arthritis 4 years ago, which is just an insane amount of unclaimed fire energy in his body, all of his joints and all of his organs. That was the turning point, and recognizing, I need to be in my life for me, and he needs to be in his life for him. And then it kind of flowed from there. So we have a very different relationship now. They'll see me breathe, they'll see me have tears. One of them will say, it's just energy and information, don't worry. And another one will shut me off like a cold jerk and walk away because he can't deal with that in his own self. And then I've got a girl from my partner's, my partner from a previous marriage for him. And she's just the expression of just lock it down and blow up. And then she has deep moments of connection, and she hears herself and she breathes. And so it's all the blends of all the things possible. But it's their journey now. I really am detethered or untethered from their choices in that way.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. I'm curious, you mentioned about quite a bit of grief through perhaps the central part of what you've just been sharing. And I'm curious if there was something kind of a parallel grief component for the children.
Oh, yes. Our bodies are incredible on so many levels. We can't even begin to understand. So when I got home from we had driven across Canada, my partner and I, when we got home after several weeks away and saw the condition of my son before he was diagnosed, I knew that his body was so brilliantly expressing his unclaimed rage, but what is behind that is grief. And so that was the reminder for me to own my own. I feel like there's layers, and I don't know, in a Newtonian or a talk therapy model, they would probably say anxiety is this and grief is that and sadness is that and rage is that. And it's more tangible as sensation in my body now. So when I watch one of them be triggered and I can see where it jams itself, or if the tears are squirting, there's moments where I'm like, yeah, that is copious amounts of grief. They are all byproducts of blended families and a divorced family, and the trust and the safety in those formative years can't not cause, abandonment and thus grief issues. And the world on the whole it's just, I think part of what we can do for the earth is acknowledge our grief, is allow space and softening for that, because the other side of that is a deeply connected intimacy. And so for sure, I see it in my kiddos. They don't use that language. My 18-year-old a couple of weeks ago just broke down and was sobbing on my bed like he did when he was a little boy, which doesn't happen as often anymore. And he just, the waves and waves of what I perceive to be grief and powerlessness over what's going on, and he can't see his girlfriend, and he's, stopped it this way, and you can't go out in public, but you got to work. Like all of these things was just this undulation of this deep sadness and grief.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems, as you predicted a little while back, it seems like we've stumbled on a pretty rich pocket, this idea of parenting in this realm, in this territory. And so I'm just in just scanning for what else I'm curious about and so on. I'm, kind of singular in my focus now because it just has so much resonance, and there's so, I think my experience is that we've just barely scratched your being able to share, what this has been like in terms of being a parent and being on this path. Where I do have a little bit of curiosity that perhaps this is a good way to sort of wind up this particular time of our connecting. I'm I'm curious if you have any last sharing that you might offer to someone who's relatively new on the path of realizing something's not right with how this imaginary person is realizing how they learn to be a person in the world, and then be an adult, and then possibly be a parent. These possibly quite disturbing realizations are creeping up on them, and they're really pushing harder and harder for authentic expression rather than just being kind of held back in some little closeted area and brought out once in a while. I'm curious if you have anything that you might share with someone who's finding themselves kind of at the beginning of their path in that way. Feels like an offering that you'd like to extend.
Mm. I know for my experience, I suppose my journey, and I think like everybody else, you hear the same messages over and over, and it isn't till the moment that it's the right moment. Louise says it's never time before it's time, where you pick something up, you hear it, somebody suggests a book, and then you see it on, and those synchronicities are out there. First thing I would say is that I really don't think we came here for a bunch of doing. I really don't think the purpose for us to be here, we're all here at a unique time. There's a reason for us to be here. Not everybody's going to get this. Not everybody's going to hear it, which you were talking about, like your audience. It's who's ready to hear that. And it isn't going to be the majority of the planet. And there's always been a gentleness for me and a forgiveness and a gateway for me to be kinder to myself, and knowing I don't have to do anything. So when I let go of my soapbox, and my first career had me in such a place where I needed to be heard, and my opinion mattered, and I was firm, and I pointed to the outrages, and I dealt with things in an ethical way. And when I dropped all of that, I realized my worth inside of me, but also less is more. And I came here with a set of gifts and abilities, as did you and everybody else listening. Mm-hmm. And if you can hold space for the fact that there is nothing for you to do, and if you let go of, I got to save the world, or the whales, or the worms, or the kids, or if you can just hold long enough space to just hear yourself and recognize your own gifts in that and allow them to emanate and emerge from you in a very, there is a trajectory, there's a hum, there's an intensity, it's got to be now. You spoke to that at the beginning of our call. I know that. That's why I was called to this work. It happened in that moment, and I could hear it's now. But now on this side of it, it's like this right here, right now, this breath, the coffee grounds sitting on my counter that are going to go infuse the lifespan of my garden space. There's nothing for me to do until impulse arrives and it feels in alignment with authentically who I am. I held so much responsibility in my life for I got to, fix and save and all those sorts of things. Gaia is going to be just fine. She'll flick us off like the fleas we are, if that is what is required. Mm-hmm. But if you can hold the space for, you came here to be authentically you, and in that there is no doing, and just seek to be as present and in a being state as possible, that's profound. That changes realities in an instant. In a moment of my willingness to just stay with my breath and not react to the teenagers are great for this. They always have some sort of foo-foo thing that needs to be dealt with immediately. So it's been this practice of, wow, take it in, listen for myself, and then, and then I choose, or it's not now, or until it emerges from you and it's not a doing. It's less energy, it's more in alignment, it's way more profound, it happens better. So be gentle and kind with yourself and listen, give yourself that space to just be who you are. And if you don't know, that's cool too, but understand that changes and shifts with every breath. Every time I give myself the gift of a moment of a breath and a transformation, I change again. And whatever that environment is. So for some people that's outside, for some people that's dancing, for some people that's painting.
Mm-hmm. Mandy Sandbach, really, really good to meet you. I love that we just trusted it to this time together to just launch in, see what happened. No surprise, really, that it worked out. I look forward to, if you're up for it, I'd very much like to do a deep dive into a conversation about conscious parenting in a time of stolen dreams and so on, that just to go with the official title of that. It seems like there's really an extraordinary deepening of the conversation really since the COVID time, that for whatever reason, it just seems like it's a good time to deepen and refine that conversation. So I'd really love to do that with you when we might get a chance to do that. Yeah. And thank you so much for generously sharing your time and your experience and sharing with us about, particularly about your family and how that's been, how it's evolved over time. I'm hoping that this will be as useful for the viewers of this podcast as it's been for me to really hear that kind of generous sharing about moving from a non-transformation based reality to a transformation based reality. And for me, that just never ceases to be extraordinary. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. I feel so much more of myself now than when we started, and there's a sweet quality to that. And I think as much as we can be in that space, like, how great would that be? So thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.